For 2 years after the killing winter of 1887, the people of Redstone Canyon bought their medicines from two orphan girls they once said would starve before the snow melted. The older one was 18. The younger one was 15. They had no father. They had no mother. They did not have a single coin between them when the fever took both parents in the span of 14 days. But they had something no one else in that canyon possessed. And it would take a drought that killed half the livestock in the county before anyone understood what it was. Stay with me. The canyon sat tucked against a sandstone escarpment in the southeastern corner of Colorado Territory, where the cliffs rose 300 feet straight up and turned the color of dried blood every evening when the sun hit them just right. It was cattle country, or it had been. 17 ranches had operated in the valley at its peak. By the spring of 1888, only 4 remained, and one of those belonged to 2 sisters no one expected to last the summer. Their names were Cressida and Evangeline Ashford. Cress was 18 years old, 5'4", with hands so callous they caught on cotton like sandpaper. Her skin had the color of saddle leather from years of helping her father work the terraces he had cut by hand into the south-facing slope below the cliff. Her hair, once the color of dark honey, had gone gray at the temples. Not from age, from grief. It happened the week her parents died, and it never changed back. Evangeline, whom everyone called Evie, was 15. She was quicker than her sister, lighter on her feet, with eyes that noticed everything and forgot nothing. She could identify 47 plants by smell alone before she turned 12. Their grandmother had called it a gift. Their grandmother had been right about many things. The fever came in October of 1887, riding into Redstone Canyon on the back of a cattle drive that passed through from Texas. Scarlet fever, some called it. Others called it simply the death. It moved through the valley like a scythe through wheat, taking the young and the old and sometimes those in between. Edmund Ashford, the girl's father, fell sick on the 3rd of October. He was a quiet man, a good man, a man who had built his homestead with his own hands and never asked anyone for help he could not repay. He lasted 9 days. Violet Ashford, their mother, held her husband's hand as he died. She kissed his forehead when his breathing stopped. She walked outside into the cold October air and stood looking at the mountains for a long time. 5 days later, she was gone too. Cress buried them both. She buried them on the ridge above the cabin, the place where her father liked to sit in the evenings and watch the light change on the cliffs. She drove the marker posts herself, using a sledgehammer that weighed nearly as much as she could lift. 3 feet into rocky ground, for each of them. Her hands bled. She did not stop. Evie lay inside the cabin, burning with fever, too sick to stand, too sick to help, too sick to know that she was now an orphan. She cried out in her sleep, calling for their mother, and Cress would leave the graves to hold her sister's hand and whisper lies about how everything would be all right. Then she would go back outside and keep digging. The dog sat beside her through all of it. His name was Thistle, and he had been their father's dog, a gray creature with silver in his coat and eyes the color of amber. People said he was more wolf than dog. People said he understood language like a person. Cress did not know if that was true, but she knew he had not left her side since the day her father stopped breathing. He sat beside the graves without making a sound. He watched her work. He pressed his head against her knee when she finally dropped the sledgehammer and stood there shaking in the cold. That was the night the first hard freeze came, and the winter that followed was the worst anyone could remember. The temperature dropped to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit on the 3rd of December. It did not rise above zero for 31 consecutive days. Snow buried the valley 4 feet deep. The creek froze solid from bank to bank, and the ice was thick enough to drive a wagon across. On the Brennan Ranch, 2 miles north, 47 head of cattle froze standing in a draw where they had huddled for shelter. Orson Brennan found them in the morning, a wall of ice-covered bodies stiff as fence posts, their breath frozen in crystals on each other's hides. Half the livestock in the canyon died that winter. Some ranchers lost everything. The Whitmore family, who had been in the valley since territorial days, loaded what they could into a wagon and left before February. The Garrison brothers sold their land for a quarter of its value to a speculator from Denver who never came to see it. By spring, the canyon had the feel of an abandoned camp. Empty corrals, doors banging in the wind. The smell of death still rising from snowmelt draws where carcasses thawed in the warming sun. Cress and Evie lost their 4 remaining cows. They lost their chickens, all 12 of them. They nearly lost Thistle, who developed a cough in January that had him wheezing by the stove for 3 weeks. Evie nursed him back to health. She stayed up through the long, frozen nights, keeping the fire hot, keeping water warm, keeping her hands on his gray fur, and talking to him in a low voice about nothing and everything while her sister slept. The dog survived, the sisters survived, and they did not leave. Cress remembered her grandmother. Margareta Engel had come to America from Bavaria in 1842, a girl of 16 with nothing but a small leather bag and a head full of knowledge that her mother and grandmother had passed down through generations. She settled in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where she met a German farmer and married him and bore 7 children, only 4 of whom lived past their 10th birthday. But what people remembered about Margaret Engel was her garden. It was not a garden of flowers, though flowers grew there. It was a garden of medicine, chamomile and yarrow, lavender and sage, comfrey for wounds, rosemary for memory, feverfew for headaches, lemon balm for grief. People came from 30 miles in every direction to buy what Margaret grew. The local doctor admitted, quietly and only to his wife, that her comfrey poultices worked better than anything he could order from Philadelphia. Cress had been 8 years old when her grandmother took her by the hand and walked her through every row. It was a summer afternoon, hot and bright, and the scent of lavender was so thick it seemed to have weight. Margaret moved slowly through the garden, stopping at each plant, naming it, explaining what it needed and what it could do. "This is yarrow," she had said, breaking a stem and holding it under young Cressida's nose. "For bleeding, for fever, for women's pain." She pressed the stem into Cress's small hand. "Remember this one. The world always needs yarrow." Cress had never forgotten. When she was 16 and her family moved west to Colorado Territory, she brought a small canvas pouch sewn shut with waxed thread. Her grandmother had given it to her on the day they left, pressing it into her hands with eyes that were already clouding with age. Inside were seeds: lavender, sage, chamomile, comfrey, yarrow, rosemary, feverfew, lemon balm. "Plant them," her grandmother had said, "in wherever you go. Plant them and remember." Cress had planted a small patch behind the cabin the first spring they arrived in Redstone Canyon. She tended it carefully, though the cattle operation consumed most of her time and attention. The herbs grew, she dried what she could, but it was a sideline, a private comfort, nothing more. Then her parents died, and everything changed. In the first weeks after the burial, Cress moved through the days like a woman walking underwater. She fed Evie, who was slowly recovering from the fever. She fed herself, though food tasted like ash. She kept the fire burning. She hauled water from the creek until the creek froze solid, and then she melted snow in pots over the fire. She did not cry. She did not have time to cry. Evie cried enough for both of them, waking in the night calling for their mother, sobbing until her voice went hoarse, and Cress would hold her and stroke her hair and say nothing because there was nothing to say. Their parents were gone. Their livestock was dying. Their neighbors, what few remained, looked at them with the kind of pity that comes before forgetting. 2 orphan girls alone on a homestead in the middle of nowhere. Everyone knew how that story ended. Silas Garrett, who ran the general store in town, said it plainly one afternoon when he thought no one important was listening. "Those 2 girls will not make it through spring. Mark my words. They will be begging for charity by February or dead by March." His words traveled, as words do in small places. They reached Cress 3 days later, carried by Elspeth Brennan, the only woman in the valley who bothered to check on the Ashford sisters. Elspeth was Orson Brennan's wife, a kind woman with tired eyes and work-worn hands who brought bread and gossip in equal measure. She told Cress what Silas had said, not to be cruel, but because she believed Cress deserved to know. Cress listened without expression. "Thank you for telling me," she said when Elspeth finished. That was all. But that night, after Evie had fallen asleep and Thistle lay curled by the stove, and the cabin was quiet except for the wind howling across the frozen valley, Cress sat at the kitchen table and made a decision. She would not leave. She would not die. She would not give Silas Garrett or anyone else the satisfaction of being right. In February, when the worst of the cold finally began to break, Orson Brennan came to the cabin. He was a hard man, Orson. 52 years old, built like a fence post, with a face that had seen too much weather and eyes that gave nothing away. He owned the largest ranch still operating in the valley. He had lost 47 cattle in the freeze, but he had enough remaining to rebuild. He stood at the gate with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that Cress could not quite read. "I have come to make an offer," he said. She stood in the doorway with Thistle at her side. The dog's hackles were not raised, but his gaze never left Orson's face. "What kind of offer?" "I will buy your land," Orson said. "Fair price. Enough for you and your sister to get to Denver. Start over somewhere that makes sense. You are young. You can find work. You can find husbands." He said it like he was doing them a favor. Cress looked at him for a long time. She looked at the ridge where her parents were buried. She looked at the terraces her father had built along the cliff face, the grapevines still dormant under their blanket of snow, the small patch of herbs behind the cabin that had somehow survived the freeze. "No," she said. Orson's expression flickered. Surprise, maybe, or annoyance. "You cannot run a homestead alone. Two girls with no experience, no capital, no, Cress said again, and this time her voice had an edge to it. "This land belonged to my father. It belongs to us now. We are not leaving." Orson stared at her. Then he put his hat back on his head. "You will change your mind," he said. "Winter will do that. When you are ready to talk sense, you know where to find me." He turned and walked away. Cress watched him go. She did not change her mind. The discovery happened in March. On a day when the temperature finally climbed above freezing for the first time in months. Cress was inspecting the terraces for frost damage. Her father had built them over the course of 3 years, cutting into the slope below the cliff face, hauling soil from the creek bottom, reinforcing the walls with stacked sandstone. 4 terraces running 60 feet along the base of the cliff, planted with grapevines that ripened 2 weeks earlier than anything else in the valley. The cliff made it possible. The red sandstone held the sun's heat during the day and released it slowly through the night. It created a pocket of warmth against the rock, a small mercy in a landscape that offered few. Cress was checking the vines, looking for damage, when she noticed something she had never seen before. A dark stain on the rock above, high up, perhaps 80 feet from the base of the cliff. It was too consistent to be shadow, too dark to be wet snow. She had looked at that cliff face 1,000 times in her life. She had never noticed this stain. She began to climb. It was not an easy climb. The sandstone was loose in places, crumbling under her boots, and the slope was steep enough that she used her hands more than her feet. Her fingers ached. Her legs burned. Twice she slipped and caught herself, and once she opened a gash on her palm that bled down her wrist and dripped onto the rock below. Thistle watched from the base of the cliff, his eyes tracking her progress, his ears forward, his tail perfectly still. It took her 20 minutes to reach the stain. What she found changed everything. A shallow cave opened in the rock face behind a lip of overhanging stone. It was no deeper than 8 feet, no wider than 6. At the back of the cave, water seeped steadily from a crack in the sandstone. Not a trickle, not a drip. A slow, constant flow, as if the rock itself were bleeding. The water collected in a natural basin worn into the cave floor, a pool about 3 feet across and 6 inches deep, before spilling over the edge and running down the rock face in a thin sheet that disappeared into a crack 20 feet below. Cress cupped the water in her bleeding hands and drank. It tasted of minerals, iron and something else, something clean and sharp, like the smell of rain on hot stone. And all around the seep, in the dead of winter, life clung to the rock. Mosses in dense green mats, tiny ferns no bigger than her thumbnail, moisture beating on stone that should have been frozen solid. Life where there should have been none. She sat in the cave for a long time, listening to the water, feeling the cool air on her face, while Thistle barked once from far below, wondering where she had gone. A spring, a hidden spring that no one knew existed. No one in the valley, no one who had surveyed this land. No one who had lived here for decades or passed through on their way to somewhere else. Just her. She said nothing about it. Not to Evie at first, not to Elspeth Brennan, who came by every 2 weeks with bread and news, not to anyone. She remembered something her father had told her once, years ago, when she was still too young to understand what it meant. The moment you tell people about a resource, it stops being yours. He had been talking about water rights, about the ranchers who fought over creek access, who hired lawyers and sometimes guns to settle disputes over who could draw from which source. Water was life in this country, and life was not given away freely, but she could not keep it from Evie forever. Her sister noticed the changes first. The way Cress disappeared up the cliff for hours at a time, the clay stains on her clothes, the sunburn on her face despite the cold. "What are you doing up there?" Evie asked one evening, her eyes sharp with that particular intelligence that had always made her seem older than her years. Cress looked at her sister, looked at this girl who had lost both parents and nearly died herself, and somehow still found the strength to smile. "Come with me tomorrow," she said. "I will show you." They climbed together the next morning, Cress leading the way, showing Evie where to put her hands and feet, on catching her when she slipped. Thistle stayed below, watching with his steady gaze, trusting them to return. When Evie saw the spring, she went silent. She reached out and touched the water. She looked at the moss, the ferns, the impossible green in the midst of death. "Does anyone else know?" she asked. "No. Are you going to tell them?" Cress shook her head. Then Evie surprised her. She knelt beside the pool and looked up at her older sister, with eyes that held no fear, only certainty. "Then we build," she said. "We build something they cannot take away." The work began that week. Cress hauled red clay from the creek bed, bucket by bucket, and used it to line a narrow channel from the cave mouth down the cliff face. She cut the channel into the rock where she could, packed clay into crevices where she could not. She then sealed the joints with pine pitch that she boiled in a tin can over a fire. It was brutal work. It was dangerous work. She slipped twice on the cliff face. The first time, she caught herself on a jutting stone and tore her trousers at the knee. The second time, she fell 8 feet and opened a gash on her shin so deep that bone gleamed white through the blood. Evie cleaned the wound with water boiled over the fire. Cress packed it with comfrey paste from her small garden. The poultice smelled of earth and green things, and within a week the wound was closing clean with no sign of infection. "Grandmother knew," Evie said, watching the wound heal. "She knew what she was teaching you." Cress said nothing, but she thought about Margaret every day, every hour. Every time she climbed the cliff and worked the channel and felt the water flowing beneath her hands. The work continued, 6 days a week, dawn until the light failed. At the base of the cliff, where the channel met the terraces, Cress built a cistern, stacked red sandstone 3 feet high and 4 feet across, sealed inside and out with pitch. It held perhaps 40 gallons. The channel fed it slowly, day and night. By the time the cistern was full, the overflow ran through a second channel to the terrace below, then to the next, watering each level before disappearing into the soil. By June of 1888, Cressida Ashford had a water supply that owed nothing to rain, nothing to the creek, nothing to anyone. And then she did the thing that made people certain she had lost her mind. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Poitras Cress has just discovered a hidden spring that could change everything, but she has a choice to make. Does she use it for the grapevines her father planted, the ones everyone knows about? Or does she do something completely different? Pause the video and leave a comment. Tell me what you would do in her place. Then keep watching to find out what Cress decided. She tore out half her grapevines. The vines were healthy. They were established. They had survived the worst winter in memory and were already showing new growth in the warming spring air. They produced grapes that she could sell for a fair price at the trading post in town. Pulling them out was like burning money, and everyone said so. "She tore out good vines for weeds," Silas Garrett said, leaning on his counter with his arms folded, speaking to anyone who would listen. "You cannot sell flowers to cattlemen," said Orson Brennan, who had rebuilt after the winter with borrowed money and a grudge against anyone whose approach to the land differed from his own. Declan Hollister, a young rancher of 24 who worked a spread in the next valley over, rode in specifically to see what the fuss was about. He stood at the edge of the road watching Cress work and laughed out loud. "I bet $5 she gives up before August," he announced to no one in particular. "Who wants in?" Prudence Whitmore, who knew everything that happened in the valley because she made it her business to know, shook her head with practiced sympathy. "Poor things. Those orphan girls have no one to guide them. They do not know what is good for them." Dr. Josiah Whitlock, who practiced medicine in the next county over and rode through Redstone twice a year, heard about it from Silas Garrett and offered his professional opinion. An 18-year-old girl knows nothing about medicinal herbs. You cannot simply plant things and dry them and call it medicine. There are processes, standards. She will poison someone. The words spread through the valley like fire through dry grass. They reached Cress within the week. She did not respond. She did not argue. She simply kept working. What she planted in place of the vines was lavender, sage, chamomile, comfrey, yarrow, rosemary, lemon balm, feverfew. She planted them in rows along the terraces, spacing them carefully, mixing the varieties so that the taller plants sheltered the shorter ones from wind. She mulched with straw. She watered from her cistern. She built a drying shed against the cliff wall, a lean-to of salvaged lumber with open slat walls that allowed air to circulate, while the overhanging rock above kept rain off. She hung the herbs in bundles from pegs she drove into the stone. And in the evenings, when the sun-heated cliff released its warmth, the rising air moved through the bundles and dried them slowly, evenly, perfectly. By August, the drying shed smelled so strongly of lavender and sage that Thistle would sneeze when he lay too close to it. Evie worked beside her through all of it. Evie, who was 15 but seemed older. Evie, who had her grandmother's gift for recognizing plants and her father's gift for organization. Evie, who kept records in a leather-bound journal, noting when each variety was planted, when it flowered, when it was ready for harvest. When the sisters worked in silence much of the time, there was not much need for words. They understood each other in the way that people understand each other when they have survived the same loss, when they have buried the same parents, when they have looked into the same darkness and decided to keep walking. But sometimes in the evenings, when the light was going gold on the cliffs and the scent of herbs hung thick in the air, one of them would say something. "Remember when grandmother made tea for us?" Evie asked one night. "Chamomile with honey. She said it would help us sleep." Cress remembered. She remembered sitting at her grandmother's kitchen table in Pennsylvania, small hands wrapped around a warm cup, the taste of honey and flowers on her tongue. "She said it would fix almost anything," Cress said. "Chamomile tea and thyme." Evie smiled. "Do you think she was right?" Cress looked at her sister, looked at the terraces below them, green and growing, looked at the cliff above, hiding its secret. "I think she knew more than anyone gave her credit for," she said. Cress had calculated something that no one else in the valley had considered. Dr. Thomas Mercer, the only physician within a 2-day ride, ordered his medicinal herbs by mail from a supplier in St. Louis. The shipments took 6 to 8 weeks. They arrived sporadically, sometimes damaged by moisture, sometimes not at all. A tin of dried chamomile that cost 12 cents in St. Louis cost Dr. Mercer 65 cents by the time it reached his office, counting freight, handling, and the fact that a quarter of every shipment arrived unusable. Dried comfrey root was worse. Yarrow, witch doctor, Shunit Mercer used for everything from wound care to fever reduction, was sometimes unavailable for months. Cress brought her first delivery to Dr. Mercer's office in September of 1888. She carried it in a wooden crate lined with cheesecloth. Inside were bundles of dried chamomile, lavender, sage, comfrey leaf, comfrey root, yarrow, and rosemary. Each bundle was tied with cotton string and labeled in her clear, careful handwriting. Dr. Mercer opened the crate on his desk and went silent. He was a man of 55, gray at the temples, with wire-rimmed spectacles and hands that shook slightly from too much coffee and too many late nights. He had been practicing medicine in Colorado Territory for 20 years. He had seen a great deal. He had never seen anything quite like this. He picked up a bundle of chamomile and held it to his nose. He crumbled a dried sage leaf between his fingers. He examined the comfrey root, which Cress had cleaned and sliced and dried on racks until it was hard and free of mold. "How much?" he asked. "Half what you pay from St. Louis," Cress said. And I can deliver monthly. He looked at her. This girl of 18 standing in his office with her calloused hands and her gray-streaked hair and her eyes that held something he could not quite name. He bought the entire crate. He paid her $4.20, roughly what she would have earned from a season's worth of grapes. "Can you add peppermint to the next delivery?" he asked. "I can." But someone else had taken notice of the green terraces against the brown valley. Cornelius Blackwood had been watching. He had arrived in Redstone Canyon in the summer of 1888. A man of 45 with a black vest he wore in all weather and eyes that calculated the value of everything they looked at. He came from Denver, where he had made a small fortune buying land from desperate homesteaders and selling it to railroads and mining companies for 3 times what he paid. Through the spring and summer of that year, while Cress built her drying shed and harvested her first crop, Blackwood had quietly bought every parcel of land that bordered the Ashford homestead, the abandoned Garrison place to the north, the old Whitmore claim to the east, a narrow strip along the creek that no one thought was worth anything. He paid cash. He asked no questions. He signed papers in Denver and sent agents to handle the details. By September, when Cress made her first delivery to Dr. Mercer, Cornelius Blackwood owned every piece of land that touched hers. He had built a wall around her without her knowing. The only way in or out of the Ashford homestead now ran across land that belonged to him. He was patient, Blackwood. He could wait. But he was also watching those green terraces, watching the water that should not exist, watching and calculating and planning his next move. By December, Dr. Mercer had told a colleague about his new supplier. Dr. Harlan Wells practiced in a mining town 2 days' ride to the south. He sent a letter to Cress in January of 1889, enclosing a standing order for chamomile, yarrow, and comfrey delivered quarterly at prices that made Cress sit down at her kitchen table and recalculate her income twice. She did not believe the numbers. She calculated them again. They were real. By March, a pharmacist in the railroad town of Dunmore, a man named Elihu Stokes, who ran the only drugstore between the territorial capital and the Colorado border, heard about the herb woman of Redstone Canyon. He sent a rider with an order form and a bank draft. In May of 1889, exactly 1 year after she had torn out her grapevines, Cressida Ashford's terraces produced more income per foot of ground than any cattle operation in the county. The figures were not close. A steer brought perhaps $30 at market after 2 years of feeding and care on 100 acres of grazing land. Cress's terraces covered less than a quarter acre. They brought in more than $200 that year, a sum that would have been unthinkable to any rancher in the valley. People stopped laughing. They did not stop talking. But the tone changed. "She is clever," Silas Garrett admitted, though he said it grudgingly. "I will give her that." "It will not last," Orson Brennan said, but he said it quieter than before. And then the drought came. The summer of 1889 was the driest anyone could remember. June brought no rain at all, not a single afternoon thunderstorm, not even the brief spitting showers that usually rolled off the mountains twice a week. The sky was blue, impossibly blue, the kind of blue that should have been beautiful but instead felt wrong, like a smile on a face that had no reason to smile. The creek, which had never failed in living memory, slowed to a trickle by the middle of the month. By the 1st of July, it was a series of disconnected pools, each smaller than the last, scummed with green algae and ringed with the tracks of desperate animals. By the 15th, it stopped entirely. For the first time in anyone's memory, you could walk across the creek bed in good shoes and not get them wet. Wells went dry across the valley. The Brennan well, which was 28 feet deep and had always been reliable, dropped below the pump line in late June and never recovered. Pete Kincaid, who had a small homestead to the east, dug his well another 6 feet and hit dry sandstone. The new families, the Darbys and the Mallisters and the Coles, had shallow wells that failed first and fastest. Cattle congregated around mud holes and bawled through the night, a sound that carried across the valley in the dry air and made sleep impossible. Orson Brennan lost 30 head to dehydration before he managed to drive the rest to a spring 6 miles up the canyon. Now, it was a brutal 2-day effort that left 3 more dead along the trail. Pete Kincaid's hayfield, which should have been chest-high by July, turned brown and crackled underfoot like paper. The grass in the valley went from green to yellow to the color of old bone. Dust rose from every hoof print, every wagon wheel, every footstep, and Cressida Ashford's terraces stayed green. People noticed. They could not help noticing. The rest of the valley was brown and dying. Dust clouds rose with every breath of wind. The air smelled of dead grass in desperation. And there, against the cliff, the herb terraces grew thick and fragrant. The lavender was so heavy with bloom that it looked purple from half a mile away. The sage stood silver green and healthy. The chamomile had flowered twice already and was preparing for a third. It was impossible. And it was right there for everyone to see. Elspeth Brennan came by on a Tuesday afternoon in July, ostensibly to bring bread. She stood at the gate and looked at the terraces for a long time without speaking. Her face held something between wonder and suspicion. Thistle sat beside Cress's boot, still as stone. "Cress," Elspeth said carefully. "How?" Cress considered the question. She looked up at the cliff, at the spot where the cave hid behind its overhang, invisible from below. "The cliff takes care of what is planted against it," she said. Elspeth was not satisfied, but she did not press. Others were less diplomatic. Silas Garrett came out to the property, the first time he had visited in 2 years, and walked the terraces with an expression that moved from curiosity to confusion, to something close to anger. "You have water," he said. It was not a question. "I do." "From where?" "From the rock." He stared at her. "There is no spring on this claim. It has been surveyed." Cress said nothing. She let him look. She let him walk the terraces and examine the cistern, which was full and quietly overflowing. She let him see the channel running up the cliff face, disappearing into the rock above. "I will be damned," he said. She did not explain further. She did not need to. Cornelius Blackwood made his move on a morning in late July. His horse was a fine bay mare, better bred than anything else in the valley. His boots were polished despite the dust. His manner was pleasant in the way that a snake's pattern is pleasant, all smooth lines and hidden purpose. "Miss Ashford," he said, removing his hat with a gesture that was almost courtly. "I hope you will forgive the intrusion." Cress stood on the porch with Thistle at her side. The dog's hackles were raised just slightly, his lips pulled back from his teeth without making a sound. Evie stood behind her sister, watching through the window. "What do you want?" Cress asked. Blackwood smiled. It was the kind of smile that did not reach his eyes. "I want to make you an offer," he said, "for your land. I am prepared to pay generously, more than Orson Brennan offered, more than anyone else would pay. The land is not for sale." He nodded as if he had expected this answer. "Everything is for sale, Miss Ashford. It is simply a matter of finding the right price, not this." He looked past her at the terraces, at the green against the brown, at the cistern quietly overflowing. "You have water," he said, "in a drought. That is quite remarkable. I tend the soil. The rock does the rest." A Blackwood's smile did not waver. "I am sure it does. But water rights are complicated things, Miss Ashford, especially water that comes from underground sources, springs, aquifers. Such things often fall under territorial jurisdiction rather than private ownership." Cress felt something cold move through her. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that you should consider my offer carefully, because if that water comes from a source that is not legally yours, well," he spread his hands, "things could become difficult." He paused. "I should mention that I own every piece of land that borders your property. The Garrison Place, the Whitmore claim, the strip along the creek. Every road in and out of this homestead crosses my land." He let that settle. "I am a patient man, Miss Ashford, but my patience has limits. Think about what I have said." Then he rode away. That night, Evie found Cress sitting at the kitchen table in the dark. "What did he mean?" Evie asked. "About the water not being ours?" Cress did not answer for a long time. "He means to take it," she said finally. "One way or another, he means to take everything." "What do we do?" Cress looked at her sister, this girl who had lost her parents and nearly died and still managed to smile. This girl who worked beside her every day without complaint. This girl who was the only family she had left. We keep going, Cress said. We do not stop, and we do not let him see us afraid. I want to pause here and ask you something. Cress is facing a threat she never expected. A man with money and lawyers who wants to take everything she has built. He owns all the land around her. He is threatening to use the law to steal her water. What would you do in her place? Would you fight? Would you run? Would you try to negotiate? Leave a comment and tell me your answer. Then keep watching to see what happened next. Orson Brennan came to the gate on a morning in the third week of July. Cress saw him from the porch. She saw the way he walked, slower than usual, his shoulders hunched forward like a man carrying weight. She saw his hat in his hands. She had never seen Orson Brennan with his hat in his hands. Thistle stood beside her, watching. Orson stopped at the gate. He did not open it. He did not step through. For a long moment he said nothing. His jaw was set so tight that the muscles in his neck stood out like cords. His eyes were fixed on the ground at his feet. I need water, he said. 3 words. They cost him more than anything he had ever said in his life. Cress looked at him. This was the man who had come to her door in February, the winter after her parents died. The man who had offered to buy her land for a fraction of its value. The man who had told her she could not run a homestead alone. The man who had called her foolish in front of his neighbors and his wife and anyone else who would listen. The man who had said when she tore out her grapevines that the winter had broken her mind. She could have refused him. She could have turned him away the way he had turned away from her grief, her struggle, her determination. She could have watched him walk back to his dying ranch with nothing. Instead, she opened the gate. I know, she said. There was no triumph in her voice, no satisfaction, no revenge. She handed him a hoe. The sage needs weeding, she said. Start at the second terrace. Yet he looked at her. She looked back. And something passed between them that neither of them could have put into words. Something about pride and humility. Something about what it means to need help and what it means to give it. Orson Brennan took the hoe. He walked to the second terrace. He began to work. He did not speak for the first hour. The sun climbed higher. The heat built. The cliff wall radiated warmth, and the smell of lavender and sage thickened until it seemed to have weight. Cress worked nearby, tying bundles of yarrow, not watching him but aware of him. Evie moved along the lower terrace, harvesting chamomile, her quick hands moving through the white and yellow flowers with practiced ease. Thistle lay in the shade of the drying shed, his eyes half closed, and Orson Brennan pulled weeds from the sage bed, his movements slow and deliberate, his face unreadable. Then, without looking up, he spoke. I called you crazy. Cress did not stop working. I know. I said the winter broke your mind. I heard. He pulled another weed. Another. I was wrong. Cress straightened. She looked at him. He was still not looking at her. His eyes were fixed on the soil, on his hands, on anything but her face. I was wrong, he said again. About all of it. She did not respond. She walked to the cistern. She filled a canteen with water that was cool and clean and tasted of stone and iron. She brought it back and held it out to him. He took it. He drank. The yarrow needs cutting next, she said. He nodded. He worked until sunset. When he left, his shirt was soaked with sweat and his hands were blistered, and he had not said another word. But he came back the following week. And the week after that, and he never called her crazy again. By the end of August, 6 families were working the terraces in rotation. The arrangement was simple. 1 day's work earned a week's water for a household. 2 days earned enough to keep a kitchen garden alive through the drought. No money changed hands. No debts were owed. No obligations extended beyond the work itself. Pete Kincaid came with his wife and 3 children. His hayfield was dead, his cattle sold off for what little he could get, but his family needed water. The Darby family came, new to the valley, their shallow well the first to fail. 3 children under the age of 10 and another on the way. The Mallisters came, the Coles came. Even Silas Garrett came to the gate one afternoon. He was the man who had said she would starve before spring. The man who had spread the gossip that traveled through the valley like fire. He stood at the gate with his shoulders hunched forward, looking everywhere except at her face. He did not say what he needed. He did not have to. Cress handed him a shovel before he could open his mouth. "We are expanding the lower terrace," she said. "Start there." He started. The people who came to work the terraces learned without meaning to. They learned which plants were which. They learned what they were used for. They learned when to harvest and how to dry and what each variety needed. The terraces became a kind of open classroom where the lessons were delivered through the hands rather than through words. Verity Brennan, Orson's daughter, came nearly every day. She was 16 years old, quiet and watchful, awestruck with her mother's kind eyes and her father's stubbornness. She and Evie had been friends before the drought. Now they worked side by side, and Evie taught her what their grandmother had taught them. "This is chamomile," Evie said, showing Verity how to pick the flowers at just the right moment, when the white petals had begun to fold back from the yellow center. For sleep, for calm, for grief. "This is comfrey," showing her how to slice the root and spread it on a cloth. For bones that ache, for bruises that go deep, for wounds that need to close. "This is yarrow," showing her how to hang it upside down in loose bundles where the air could move through it. For bleeding, for fever, for women's pain. "Grandmother called it the soldier's friend," Evie said, "because it could save a man bleeding on the battlefield." Verity remembered everything. See, she would remember it for the rest of her life. But Cornelius Blackwood had not given up. In September, a letter arrived at the homestead. It was addressed to Cressida Ashford. It came from a law office in Denver. The letter informed her that a claim had been filed with the territorial court regarding water rights on her property. The claim alleged that an underground spring had been discovered on land that was not properly surveyed at the time of the original homestead filing. The claim further alleged that such springs fell under territorial jurisdiction and could not be privately owned. A hearing was scheduled for October 15, 1889. If the claim was upheld, Cress would lose the water. If she lost the water, she would lose everything. Evie found her that night sitting on the stone wall at the top of the terraces, and the letter in her hands, thistle pressed against her side. The sun had set. The cliffs were dark shapes against a sky full of stars. "He is going to take it," Evie said. "Is he not?" Cress did not answer. "What do we do?" Cress looked at the letter, looked at the words that threatened to erase everything she had built. "We go to the hearing," she said. "We tell the truth, and we hope it is enough. What if it is not? Then we find another way." She folded the letter and put it in her pocket. "Grandmother used to say that the world takes things from you," Cress said. "She said it takes and never asks permission. But she also said that every time you lose something, you get a chance to show what you are made of." Evie sat down beside her. "What are we made of?" Cress put her arm around her sister. "I guess we are about to find out." As the hearing was held in the county courthouse, a two-story building of red brick in the center of town. It was the largest building for 50 miles in any direction, and on the morning of October 15, 1889, it was full. Word had spread. People came from all over the valley, ranchers and farmers, shopkeepers and their wives, people who had worked the terraces and people who had only heard the stories. They filled the benches in the courtroom. They stood along the walls. They crowded into the doorways and the hallway beyond. Cornelius Blackwood sat at the front, beside a lawyer from Denver in a gray suit. His face was calm, confident, the face of a man who knew he was going to win. Cress sat alone. She wore her cleanest dress, the one their mother had made for her 2 years before she died. It was too small now, tight across the shoulders. And there was a mend in the sleeve that Cress had done herself, but it was the best she had. Evie sat in the front row, directly behind her. Verity Brennan sat beside Evie. Their hands were clasped together. The judge was a man named Harrison Wells. He was 60 years old, gray-bearded, with eyes that gave nothing away. He had been on the bench for 15 years. He had seen everything, or so he thought. Blackwood's lawyer spoke first. He talked about water rights and territorial law. He talked about surveys and jurisdictions. He talked about the importance of public resources and the danger of private monopolies. He made it sound reasonable, fair, even noble. The water, he concluded, belongs to the territory, to all its citizens, not to one homesteader who happened to stumble upon it. Judge Wells listened without expression. "Miss Ashford," he said when the lawyer finished, "do you have a response?" Cress stood. Her heart was pounding. Her hands were shaking. She clasped them together in front of her so no one could see. Yes, Your Honor, she took a breath. My father filed this claim in 1884, she said. He built the terraces against the cliff with his own hands. He planted the grapevines. He worked this land for 4 years before he died. I was 18 when my parents were taken by the fever. My sister was 15. We had no money, no family, no one to help us. She paused. Mr. Blackwood says the water belongs to the territory, but I found that spring. I climbed 80 feet up a cliff face to reach it. I built the channel with my own hands, bucket by bucket, stone by stone. I fell twice and nearly died. I bled onto those rocks. Her voice was steady now. I did not steal anything. I did not take anything that belonged to someone else. I found something that no one knew existed, on land that my father claimed legally, and I used it to build something that has helped my neighbors. She looked at Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood has been buying land in this valley for 2 years. He does not farm it. He does not ranch it. He buys it and holds it and waits for people to become desperate enough to sell. She looked at the judge. He does not want the water because it belongs to the territory. He wants the water because he wants to control it, to sell it, to use it to force people off their land. Blackwood's lawyer stood. Your Honor, this is speculation. Miss Ashford has no evidence. Let her finish, Judge Wells said. Cress nodded. I have no lawyer, she said. I have no money. I have nothing except the truth. And the truth is this. I am not the one trying to take something that does not belong to me. She sat down. The courtroom was silent. Then Orson Brennan stood up. Your Honor, he said, if it please the court. Judge Wells looked at him. Mr. Brennan, I would like to speak. The judge considered this. Proceed. Orson walked to the front of the courtroom. He did not look at Blackwood. He did not look at the lawyer. He looked at the judge. I have lived in this valley for 30 years, he said. I have worked this land since before Colorado was a state. I know every rock and every tree and every dry creek bed for 20 miles in any direction. He paused. When this girl tore out her grapevines, I called her crazy. I said the winter had broken her mind. I said she would fail and starve and be gone by autumn. I was wrong. He turned and looked at Cress. She built those terraces with her own hands. She dug that channel into the cliff face. She did it alone, without help from anyone, while the rest of us were too busy laughing at her to notice what she was doing. He turned back to the judge. And when the drought came, when my cattle were dying and my well was dry and I had nowhere else to go, she gave me water. She let me work her land. She did not charge me a penny. She saved my family. He pointed at Blackwood. That man has never worked a day on this land. He has never dug a well or planted a seed or buried a calf that died in the freeze. He sits in his office in Denver and waits for people to suffer, and then he buys their land for pennies on the dollar. His voice rose. Miss Ashford found that water. She built that system. It is hers. And anyone who says different is a liar and a thief. He sat down. The courtroom erupted. One by one they stood. Silas Garrett, who had said Cress would starve before spring. I was wrong about her, he said. She has more grit than any man I know. Pete Kincaid, whose hayfield had burned and whose cattle had been sold. She saved my children. My wife is pregnant. We would have lost everything without her water. The Darby family, the Mallisters, the Coles. Dr. Thomas Mercer, who had ridden 2 days to attend the hearing. The quality of her herbs is equal to or better than anything I have ever received from the East, he said. She has built something of genuine medical value. Dr. Josiah Whitlock stood in the back of the courtroom. He was the physician from the next county, or the one who had told Silas Garrett that an 18-year-old girl knew nothing about medicine. 2 months ago, curious despite himself, he had sent a writer to purchase a sample of her preparations. He had expected to find fault. He had found none. His face was red as he spoke. I examined her chamomile and her yarrow and her comfrey root, he said. The quality is exceptional. Her grandmother taught her well, and I was a fool to say otherwise. 6 families signed a letter stating that they had worked the terraces voluntarily in exchange for water, with no coercion and no complaint. 12 people testified. Every single one of them spoke for Cressida Ashford. Judge Wells listened to all of it. When the last witness had spoken, he sat in silence for a long moment. Then he picked up his gavel. "The claim," he said, "is denied." Heidi Blackwood's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, the claim is denied," Judge Wells repeated. "There is no evidence that the water source in question lies on public land. There is no evidence that Miss Ashford has violated any territorial statute. There is ample evidence that she has improved her property through her own labor and at her own risk." He looked at Blackwood. "Furthermore, I find it troubling that this claim was filed by a party with obvious financial interest in the outcome and no prior connection to the land in question." He brought the gavel down. Case dismissed. The courtroom erupted again. But this time, it was cheering. "We are almost at the end now. But before I tell you what happened after the trial, I want to hear from you. Did you expect the community to stand up for Cress the way they did? Were you surprised that the same people who once mocked her came to her defense? Leave a comment and tell me what you think. Then stay with me for the final chapter of this story. Cornelius Blackwood left Redstone Canyon 3 weeks after the trial. He sold the land he had accumulated to the families who had been working it at prices that barely covered what he had paid. He did not negotiate. He did not haggle. He simply wanted to be gone. The last thing he said to Silas Garrett at the general store was this: "She won this time. But people like her do not win forever." Silas watched him right away. He never came back. The autumn rains arrived in late October, the first significant moisture in nearly 5 months. The creek began to flow again. Wells slowly recharged. The valley, which had seemed on the verge of death, began to breathe. Oh, but things had changed. The terraces that Cress had built were no longer a curiosity or a joke. They were a model, a proof of concept. Within a year, 3 other homesteads in the valley had started their own herb gardens, using seeds and knowledge from Cress's terraces. Within 2 years, the first cooperative had formed. Farmers pooled their dried herbs and shipped them together to pharmacists in Denver and Colorado Springs, getting better prices than any of them could have gotten alone. Dr. Mercer wrote a letter to the Territorial Medical Society recommending that frontier settlements consider cultivating medicinal herbs locally rather than relying on Eastern supply chains. He cited Cress's operation as proof that it could be done. "The quality of her dried chamomile," he wrote, "it was equal or superior to any commercial preparation I have encountered in 23 years of practice." The letter was published in the Society's quarterly bulletin. A copy hung in Cress's kitchen, though she had not put it there. Elspeth Brennan had framed it and hung it without asking. The terraces expanded. By 1891, they ran 200 feet along the cliff face, tended by 9 families who worked in rotation and shared in the harvest. The drying shed had been expanded 3 times and was now a proper building with a stone floor and cedar racks and room for more herbs than Cress could have imagined when she started. The market shed at the trailhead had grown into a small store. Evie managed it with a ledger and a firm hand, to tracking inventory and orders and payments with the same methodical care that had characterized their grandmother. Verity Brennan worked beside her most days, learning the business side of things while her father worked the terraces above. The stone path from the wagon road to the gate had been laid by the people who walked it without being asked. They simply appeared one Saturday with wheelbarrows and flat stones and worked until the path was smooth and level and wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast. The spring still flowed. It had never stopped. Not in the worst drought, not in the hardest winter, not even when the creek ran dry and the wells dropped below their pump lines. The channel that Cress had built with her own hands still stood, still sealed with pitch, still quietly receiving water from the rock. She added a second cistern in 1894. It was larger than the first, and it took her a month of work. The third cistern was not her work. Orson Brennan arrived one morning in the spring of 1894 with a wagon load of cut stone. He pulled up to the gate and sat there for a moment, looking at the terraces, at the green against the slowly warming hillside. Then he climbed down. "Where do you want it?" he asked. Cress stared at him. "What?" "The cistern," he said. "I brought stone. Good stone from the quarry upriver. Where do you want it built?" She did not know what to say. Orson did not wait for an answer. He began unloading the stone, carrying it piece by piece to a spot near the second terrace that he had apparently already identified as the best location. He worked for 4 days. He did not ask for help. He did not explain himself. And he did not make speeches or offer apologies. He simply worked. When the cistern was finished, mortared and sealed and ready to fill, he walked back to his wagon. He brushed the dust from his hands. Cress met him at the gate. They stood there for a moment, neither of them speaking. Then Orson held out his hand. It was the first time he had ever done so. Cress took it. They shook, and then he climbed into his wagon and drove home without another word. Thistle died in the winter of 1900. He was 14 years old, gray from nose to tail, his eyes clouded but still watchful. He had spent his last years lying in the sun on the stone wall at the top of the terraces, watching Cress and Evie work, watching the people come and go, watching the valley change below. He died in his sleep, curled by the stove where he had always slept, when in the cabin where he had spent his whole life. Cress found him in the morning. She knew before she touched him. She knew from the stillness, from the silence, from the absence of the quiet breathing that had been a part of her life for longer than she could remember. She buried him on the ridge beside her parents, in a grave she dug herself with the same shovel she had used to dig theirs. Evie stood beside her as she worked. Neither of them spoke. When it was done, Cress stood over the grave for a long time. "Good boy," she said finally. "You were such a good boy." Then she walked back down to the cabin, and she did not cry until she was alone. But life continued. A year after Thistle's death, a gray dog with amber eyes appeared at the edge of the property. She was young, barely more than a puppy, and with the same silver coat and the same watchful expression. No one knew where she came from. Evie thought she might be Thistle's granddaughter, descended from a litter he had sired years ago with a ranch dog on the Brennan place. Cress did not know if that was true, but she named the dog Sage, and Sage stayed, and it was enough. In the autumn of 1903, a young man arrived at the gate with a notebook and a list of questions. He was from the university in the territorial capital. He was writing a report on agricultural innovation in arid regions. He had heard about the apothecary garden from 3 separate sources and could not believe what they described. Cress was 33 years old then. Her hair was fully gray. Her hands still bore the calluses of years of work, but they moved more slowly now, and on cold mornings. Her right knee ached from the fall she had taken on the cliff 15 years before. She walked him through the terraces. She showed him the drying shed, with its stone floor and cedar racks and bundles of herbs hanging from every beam. She showed him the cisterns, all 3 of them, connected by channels that distributed water to every level of the garden. She showed him the channel carved into the cliff face, disappearing into the rock above. She let him taste the water from the spring. He wrote furiously. Then he asked the questions that everyone eventually asked. "How did you know to look for the spring?" Cress thought about it. Sage pressed her head against her knee. "I did not know," she said. "I just noticed a stain on the rock. Most people do not look up." He wrote that down. "And the herbs? How did you know there would be a market?" "I knew there was a need," she said. "My grandmother taught me that if people need something and no one is providing it, there is your answer. You do not need to be clever, you just need to pay attention." He wrote that down too. His report was published the following spring. "The apothecary garden of Redstone Canyon," he wrote, "represents a model of practical innovation achieved through patience, observation, and an unwillingness to accept prevailing assumptions about what the land could support. The methods employed by Miss Ashford and her sister demonstrate that valuable agricultural enterprises can be established in marginal environments through careful attention to microclimate, water management, and traditional knowledge passed down through generations. It is a testament to what can be accomplished by those who refuse to give up." Cress never read the report. She did not need to. Evie married in 1896. Her husband was a quiet man named James Corwin, who had come to the valley to work in the mines and stayed when he met her. They built a cabin a quarter-mile from the original homestead, close enough to walk, far enough to feel like their own place. Their daughter was born in 1898. They named her Violet, after the grandmother she would never meet. By 1903, Violet was 5 years old, a quick-footed child with her mother's sharp eyes and her grandmother's love of green things. She spent her days running through the terraces, learning the names of plants before she could write them. "This is yarrow," Evie told her, just as their grandmother had told them, "for bleeding, for fever, for women's pain. Remember this one. The world always needs yarrow. On the last warm evening of that autumn, Cressida Ashford sat on the stone wall at the top of the terraces. The sun was dropping behind the ridge. The cliffs were turning their deep, impossible red, the color of dried blood, the color of rust, the color of something ancient and enduring. Sage lay at her feet, her gray coat warm against Cress's boots. Below, the terraces stretched in neat rows. The lavender had been cut back for winter. The sage was still silver green. The chamomile beds had been cleared and mulched. The cistern murmured quietly, water flowing in, water flowing out, an endless cycle that had never stopped and never would. Somewhere down the path, she could hear Violet laughing. Cress never claimed the spring was hers by right. When people asked, and they always asked, as the garden grew and the water flowed and the story spread, she said the same thing in the same quiet voice with the same steady gaze. The cliff offered it, she said. I was simply the one willing to climb. She thought about her grandmother often in those quiet evening hours. She thought about a garden in Pennsylvania, about hands that were old even then, about a voice that had explained the world in terms of roots and leaves and flowers. She thought about a small canvas pouch sewn shut with wax thread, the seeds inside it no bigger than grains of sand, the potential inside them bigger than anything she could have imagined. She thought about her parents buried on the ridge above, about her father driving posts into rocky ground, about her mother standing in the kitchen, flour on her hands, singing songs from her own childhood. She thought about Evie, who had been 15 and feverish and orphaned, who had somehow grown into a woman who could run a business and raise a daughter and still find time to teach Verity Brennan how to make comfrey poultice. She thought about Thistle, gray and loyal, waiting for her at the bottom of the cliff every time she climbed. She thought about all the people who had said she would fail, who had said she would starve, who had said the winter had broken her mind. She thought about what it felt like to prove them wrong, not with words, not with arguments, just by continuing, just by surviving, just by building something that lasted. Knowledge is not like gold, she had told Evie once, years ago. They had been sitting in the drying shed, tying bundles of lavender. The warm air rising from the sun-heated cliff moved through the open slats and carried the scent out across the valley. Gold gets smaller when you share it, Cress had said. Knowledge gets bigger. Evie had nodded, but she was young then, and Cress did not know if she understood. She understood now. They both did. The stars were beginning to appear above the canyon rim. Cress sat there a little longer, listening to the water, feeling the last warmth of the rock against her back, watching the color drain slowly from the cliffs. Then she stood. Her knee protested, as it always did now. But she had learned to move through pain. She had learned to move through a lot of things. She walked down the stone path toward the cabin. Sage padded beside her, silent and watchful, her eyes catching the last light. The lamp was already lit in the window. Yet Evie was there, probably with James and Violet. They came most evenings now. They would have dinner together. They would talk about the garden, about the orders that needed filling, about the seeds that needed saving for spring. They would talk about ordinary things, and that was enough. That was more than enough. The cabin door opened as she approached. Evie stood in the doorway, backlit by the lamp, her daughter balanced on her hip. There you are, Evie said. We were wondering if you were going to sit up there until the snow came. Cress smiled. Not tonight, she said. She stepped inside. The door closed behind her, and outside the cliffs stood silent in the darkness, holding their secrets, guarding their water, keeping watch over the valley below. Just as they always had, just as they always would. This is the end of our story. But before you go, I want to thank you for staying with me through all of it. Stories like this one remind us that strength does not always look the way we expect. Sometimes it looks like an 18-year-old girl climbing a cliff. Sometimes it looks like a 15-year-old nursing a sick dog back to health. Sometimes it looks like a community that learns, slowly and painfully, to recognize what it almost lost. If this story meant something to you, I would love to hear about it. Leave a comment and tell me what part stayed with you. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this one, and share it with someone who needs to hear that it is never too late to prove people wrong. Thank you for listening. Until next time. The end.